30 cowboys were thrown, kicked bloody, and left in the dirt by a black devil of a horse. None had the spine to ride him. Then came an Apache man, no whip, no rope, just a flute. And that was what made the beast bow his head. If that gave you chills, don't forget to drop a comment, and subscribe, because the rest of this story only gets deeper from here. "Damn fool's gonna get himself killed," Sheriff Martinez muttered under his breath, squinting into the sun as the 30th man went sailing over Diablo's back like a rag doll caught in a windstorm. The man hit the dirt with a loud thud. Broken collarbone, maybe more. Up on the porch, Eleanor McAllister didn't blink. She'd seen worse, lived through worse. Chester had made sure of that. People in the territory liked to whisper about her that she was cold, hard, unshakable. They weren't wrong, but they didn't know the half of it. Not what it took to bury a man you'd once loved. Not what it meant to carry bruises under your Sunday dress and still serve pie with a smile. What they did know, what they never stopped talking about, was Diablo. That stallion was the one thing on Eleanor's land no man could conquer. Wild-born, black as coal, and smarter than most ranch hands, Diablo had been Chester's last project before he died. He'd broken bones trying to break the horse. All he left behind were scars on the horse and on Eleanor. After Chester died, Eleanor made a promise to herself Diablo would never be broken through pain again. So she offered a challenge. $100 to any man who could sit Diablo for 3 full circles of the corral. Not a dime less, not a favor more. The winner would earn more than cash. He'd win the town's respect and Eleanor's silence. 30 men had tried. 30 had failed. And now the latest one was unconscious, his whip still clutched in his broken hand. Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't so much as twitch a muscle under her wide-brimmed hat. She only shifted her gaze calm and cold from the unconscious man to the black devil pacing inside the corral, ears back, chest heaving like a bellows. "Get that son of a bitch out of my yard," she said flatly. Murphy, the stable hand who was already sweating through his shirt, climbed under the rails with caution, dragging the injured man by his boots. Diablo snorted and kicked dust in their direction. The horse's coat was slick with sweat and streaked with old scars. Some healed, some fresh, one of them still bleeding where the whip had landed. And yet it wasn't the man's tumble that caught Eleanor's attention. It was what came next. The bastard had tried to hit the horse after falling, whipped out his damn riding crop and swung at Diablo's side with the fury of a humiliated fool. But the stallion didn't run. He turned fast and clean and kicked with such force that it sounded like someone splitting firewood. That man wasn't going to be riding for a long, long time. There was a silence that followed long, sharp biting. The kind of silence that belonged in courtrooms or on the edge of graveyards. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Not until Sheriff Martinez spat into the dirt and said, "That's 30, Ellie. 30 men, 30 busted egos," she replied, slow and even. "And not one of them worth a damn." She stood then, back straight as a rifle barrel, and stepped off the porch. Her boots struck the ground with that hard rhythm of someone used to walking alone. Dust clung to the hem of her skirt. She walked right past Martinez, past the gawkers who had gathered like they always did when a man got thrown, and stopped at the edge of the corral. Diablo watched her. He didn't like her much either. She didn't blame him. She leaned her elbows on the rail and said half to herself, "I don't care if he's the devil himself. There's not a man in this damn territory with enough spine or sense to ride him." Out in the distance, the heat shimmered like waves above the rocks, and someone moved. She saw him, barely. A shadow half merged with the mesquite brush astride a dun-colored horse. A man or a ghost maybe sitting still as stone watching. He didn't ride up, not yet, but she felt the weight of his gaze like sand in her boots. Later that evening, when the sun began to melt over the horizon, he came. No fanfare, no introduction, just the soft beat of hooves and the creak of old leather. Eleanor sat on her porch again, sipping something dark from a chipped mug. She saw him coming long before he reached the yard. A tall man, maybe mid-30s, maybe older, weathered skin, long black braid over one shoulder, no hat. His shirt was plain, his saddle worn, and his eyes, they carried something heavy, not pride, not fear, just old, quiet knowing. He stopped 10 feet from the porch, dismounted without a word, and stood there a moment like he was waiting for the earth itself to settle beneath his boots. Then he said, "I heard there's a horse needs understanding." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "What you really mean is you think you're man enough to ride him." The man looked at her. Steady, measured. "I didn't say anything about riding." She blinked. "I said understanding," he repeated. "You Apache?" she asked. She wasn't one to mince words. "Yes, ma'am. Name's Nantan Loma." She tilted her head. "You think that earns you something?" He didn't flinch. "No, ma'am. Just thought you should know what kind of man's asking." Eleanor stared at him. Not because he was Apache, she'd grown up hearing stories of scalpings and war parties, then watching men from the same bloodlines pushed into ragged tents near the river. No, she stared because he didn't carry himself like a man who wanted to prove anything. That was new. "You got a plan, Mr. Loma?" "I'd like a month," he said. "No pay, no interference. And in exchange..." He glanced toward the corral. Diablo was pacing again. "I want to see if he still remembers how to be a horse." Eleanor barked a short laugh, not mocking, surprised. "All right," she said after a pause. "You get 30 days. I won't stop you, but I sure as hell won't help you. You can sleep in the bunkhouse." "Fair enough." He nodded. She didn't shake his hand, just turned back toward the house and added, "But you better keep your funeral clothes nearby." He didn't smile, just touched 2 fingers to the brim of a hat he didn't wear and led his mare toward the barn. The town didn't like it. Next morning, word got out that Eleanor McAllister had hired an Apache not just for fencing or mucking stalls, but to tame the devil horse like he was some kind of whisperer out of a dime novel. Jake Morrison was the first to throw a fit. First, she beds that bastard Chester till he knocks her around half dead. Now she's got some redskin moving in like it's his land. He sneered at the saloon that afternoon. Doc Henderson muttered something into his bourbon about folks with nothing but air in their heads and poison in their tongues, but no one challenged Jake. They all remembered how Diablo had tossed him like a sack of potatoes 3 months back. But gossip's like wind in a canyon. It carries far and sticks to everything. The mornings out here came early and without mercy. Wind moved low along the ground like something alive, dragging dust and dry air across the porch slats, slipping into every crack. Eleanor had long ago stopped noticing the way the desert whispered in the quiet hours, but this morning she sat with her coffee long enough to hear it again. She wasn't watching the sunrise. She was watching him. The Apache Nantan Loma had been on her land for 5 days now, and for 5 days he hadn't set foot in the corral, not once. He came at dawn, same time every morning, walked up to the fence, pulled out a small folding stool from a satchel on his mare and sat. Didn't speak, didn't whistle, didn't bark commands like the others who came before. Just sat there, steady as the rocks in the cliffs behind him, and played that old cedar flute of his, long and low and sad. The damn horse was listening. Eleanor had seen Diablo buck men twice his weight drag them through the dirt, crack ribs and arms like he was snapping branches. But this watching, this stillness, she'd never seen anything like it. Nantan didn't stare the stallion down, didn't flinch when the horse flared his nostrils or pawed at the dirt. He never tried to show who was boss. He just played. Eyes half-lidded notes flowing slow and heavy like something remembered from long ago. She didn't understand it, but she couldn't look away. Later that day, she stepped out toward the corral after dinner, boots crunching softly in the gravel. Diablo was pacing. Nantan was gone. The stool still there, the flute wrapped and resting on top. And the horse, well, he was circling it, like he missed something. She felt a chill then, not fear, recognition. The next morning, Eleanor stood on the porch, arms folded, watching again. Murphy was off feeding the hens, and there wasn't another soul in sight. Nantan came quiet as always and took his place at the fence line. She called out, "You got a plan, or just enjoy serenading livestock?" He didn't answer at first, just finished tying the strap around his boot, then said without looking up, "Horse like that don't forget pain, but he might remember music." Eleanor frowned. "You think that flute's gonna do what 30 grown men couldn't?" He glanced at her finally. He doesn't need to be conquered. He needs to be heard. She didn't say a word, but she stayed there, didn't go back inside like she normally would, and for some reason that seemed to be enough. Over the next week, things didn't change, not much anyhow. Nantan still played every morning, still sat just outside the rail, but Eleanor began to watch closer, not from behind the curtain or through the screen door, but out on the porch steps. Coffee in one hand, old blanket across her lap, like it was any other quiet morning in the desert. Except it wasn't. One day she brought out a second cup, set it on the post beside her, and didn't say anything about it. He took it after his song ended, tipped his head once. No words passed. Didn't need to. That afternoon, she asked the question that had been stuck in her gut since the first day he rode in. "Why'd you come? I seen men like you before. Folks from the reservation come into town sometimes, trade their beads and leather trinkets for liquor, mutter Apache words nobody cares to understand." He paused, leaned his arms on the top rail of the corral, watching Diablo breathe slow in the shade of the fence post. "You see his sides?" he asked. She didn't answer. "You see the scars, the old ones, the ones the others gave him before they left." He turned to face her, then eyes calm but heavy. "That horse ain't mean. He's just done with being beaten." Eleanor looked down, then slowly raised her eyes to the corral. She had seen them. The marks. Some white, some red, some deep enough they looked like they'd been carved. And it hit her then, not just guilt, but something else. Shame. "I was married to a man who thought pain made things behave," she said after a long silence. "People. Animals. Me." Nantan didn't move, didn't ask for more, didn't have to. "You know what it's like?" she added, quieter now. He nodded. "My mother died sick, but she wouldn't have been that way if they hadn't pushed us out of our land. She tried to run. They caught her. My father, he pulled a rifle on the soldiers. Didn't end well." Eleanor swallowed. "They kill him?" "No," he said, voice flat. "They let him live, so he'd remember." Another long pause stretched out between them. He didn't say more about it, and she didn't push. But later that week, they sat together at dusk, sharing a plate of roasted beans and fry bread Eleanor had made herself, and he told her about what came after the years in the broken-down camp on the edge of nothing, how the tribe splintered, how he found others tried to gather what was left of the language, the stories, the old songs. He didn't cry. He didn't need to. "You know," he said, as the last of the sun dipped below the ridge, "we were taught that horses carry the memory of the wind, and they remember things better than people. You treat them with fear, they give it back. You treat them with heart, they'll walk with you, not behind you." She let the words sit there quiet and deep. "You really believe that?" she asked finally. "I do," he said, and somehow so did she. On the 12th morning, something happened. It was quiet just past 7, the air still cool. Eleanor sat close now, not on the porch, but near the fence. Nantan was playing something low, barely more than a hum through the flute. Diablo stood just a few paces away, ears forward. Then, slow, careful, the stallion stepped forward. One step, then another. Eleanor stopped breathing. Nantan kept playing, eyes closed, and Diablo, as if drawn by the sound, stretched his neck. His nostrils flared, and then impossibly he lowered his head, nudged his muzzle forward, and touched the center of Nantan's open palm. No rope, no grain, no bait, just trust. The whole ranch froze in that instant. No wind, no birds, just breath. Eleanor felt something wet on her cheek and wiped it away before it could fall. She didn't say a word, didn't need to. She didn't move, either didn't dare. Nantan stayed still, let the stallion sniff explore. Then the horse stepped back, not with fear, but caution, like the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. Later that evening, Eleanor found herself standing just outside the corral long after sundown, arms folded. Nantan was putting the flute away, wrapping it with the same care a man might show a rifle passed down from his father. "Why today?" she asked. He thought a moment, then said, "Because I waited for him to come to me, when he was ready." Eleanor nodded, the kind of nod that came not from agreement, but from understanding. "You ever think maybe people are the same way?" she asked. He gave her a look, soft at the edges, and said, "I think they're slower." That night, Eleanor didn't watch from behind the curtain. She stood by the window with the shutters wide open. She watched Diablo lie down for the first time in years. She watched Nantan walk away, slow and deliberate. And when she closed her eyes, the sound of that flute stayed with her like something deep inside was starting to heal, even if she didn't know it was broken. By the 15th day, Eleanor had started leaving the porch before sunrise. She'd walk out to the fence, coffee in hand, and just stand there as Nantan approached. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the silence between them didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like something. And every now and then Diablo would come close, not just to Nantan, but to Eleanor too. He didn't touch her yet, but he watched her, listened, like he knew she was trying too. And maybe he was waiting for her to come to him. Nantan was already up before the first sliver of sunlight cracked the sky, same as always. The quiet hours before dawn had become his time not for doing, but for readying himself, steadying what lived inside. Years ago, he'd learned that patience wasn't just a virtue, it was survival. In the life he'd lived, rushing anything, a decision, a breath, a step forward, could be the difference between seeing another day and not. Now, leaning on the fence, He watched Diablo prowl the corral like a restless spirit, the horse's dark eyes, sharp shoulders tight, and hooves brushing the dust with each turn. Nantan didn't push. He just watched, same as Diablo watched him. From behind, Eleanor came out holding 2 mugs. Her hair was pinned back without fuss, and the faded blue dress she wore looked like it had been mended more than once. Still, she moved like a woman who hadn't been broken by the years, just tempered by them. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked as she joined him by the fence. Nantan gave a slow nod, though it wasn't the whole truth. His nights were usually crowded with things best left unspoken. Flickers of firelight voices too far to reach the weight of names that never got called again. But he wasn't about to lay that out for someone he'd barely spoken to. "He's watching you," Eleanor said, gesturing with her cup toward the corral. And she was right. Diablo had parked himself close enough to see, but not close enough to trust his gaze locked steady on Nantan's every move. "That's good," Nantan said simply. "Means he's thinking, not just reacting." Eleanor glanced sideways at him, her expression unreadable. There was a calm about Nantan, a stillness that didn't feel lazy, but earned like it had been carved out of something painful and then held together with will. His hands told their own story, weathered and rough, thick with old scars like they'd handled rope and wood and metal for longer than most men lived. Eleanor knew a dodge when she heard one. She'd done the same more times than she could count. Some stories were buried too deep to dig up in daylight, especially with someone who hadn't earned the right to hear them. "I was married once," she offered, surprising herself. 8 years. Nantan turned toward her, quiet but attentive. "Folks in town say I didn't mourn him the right way," she added. "Say I moved on too quick. But the truth is, I'd already done my mourning while he was still breathing." Nantan gave her a slow nod. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of understanding that didn't need explanation. "Some marriages are for love," he said. "Some are just for surviving." The words hit something in Eleanor's chest, a place she didn't know was still sore. For 2 years, she'd carried other people's opinions like stones in her pocket, weighing her down with what she should have felt, what she should have done. But this man who'd barely said 10 full sentences since arriving understood more than any preacher or neighbor ever had. She looked at him again. "You..." He didn't move, just pressed a hand to his chest for a second, and she could see the outline of something beneath his shirt, flat and square, maybe a photo or a charm, and he said, "Once." That one word was enough. She didn't ask again. They stood together for a while in an easy quiet, both watching Diablo as he circled slow and steady. The horse seemed to be sizing them up as much as they were him. After a bit, Nantan set down his coffee. "I think I'll try something," he said. She stepped back and watched as he walked to the barn. His pace was measured movement, smooth and without tension. When he came back, he had a soft brush in one hand and a small tin pail of oats in the other. He didn't go straight to the fence. Instead, he took a spot about 15 feet out and sat on a flat stump right there in the dirt. He began brushing the bristles with slow, practiced motions, not looking up, not making a fuss. "What's the plan here?" Eleanor asked. Showing him. "I'm not in a rush," Nantan said, still focused on the brush. "He sets the pace. Not me." That caught Diablo's attention. The stallion's head lifted, ears pricked forward. He inched closer to the fence but kept his distance. Nantan kept working, never looking directly at the horse, avoiding anything that might feel like a threat. After a few minutes, he began to hum. Not a song, really, just a low, rhythmic sound that rolled through the still air. Diablo slowed his pacing, came to a stop. then just stood there watching. "He likes it," Eleanor said under her breath. "Most do," Nantan replied, still humming, still brushing. "They don't speak our language, but they know when the world's calm and when it ain't." Eleanor found herself leaning on the fence, drawn in. There was something peaceful about the moment. Not sleepy, but steady. Nantan's way was nothing like the men she'd seen try to force their will on Diablo. No shouting, no whips, no rope burns. Just time, just patience. "Tell me about Chester," Nantan said softly. Eleanor didn't answer right away. It had been a long while since anyone had asked, longer, still since anyone asked without judgment in their tone. "He was rough," she said finally. "Hard man. Hard on the animals. Harder on the land. Hardest on me. He believed everything in life needed to be whipped into line." She paused, then added, "And I believed that too. Back then, that control meant strength. Took me years to learn otherwise." Nantan didn't speak, just kept humming slow and low like he was giving her room to say more. She did. One time he tried to break a young stallion, kept that poor thing tied down and starving for days. Told me it'd come around once it was weak enough to listen. It did break in the end, but not in a good way. It never looked at people the same after that. Just stood in the corner of the corral until the day it died. Nantan's humming faded, but his hands kept moving smooth and quiet. "What changed your mind?" he asked. "I saw myself in that horse," she said, "and I didn't want to go the same way." Without thinking, Eleanor's fingers slid to her left hand, tracing the familiar band of gold wrapped around her ring finger. The diamond had long since been turned inward, hidden from view, pressed against her skin, where the world couldn't see it. Nantan noticed it, though he said nothing. "I watched Chester try to break a mustang once," she said, her voice low and steady. "It was a gorgeous animal, wild-eyed, full of fight. One of those creatures that made you believe in freedom just by looking at it." She paused, watching Diablo as he paced slow circles through the dust. Chester didn't care about that. He only saw something that wouldn't obey, and he made it his mission to crush the fire out of that horse no matter how long it took or what he had to do. Her jaw tightened. Eventually he got what he wanted. The horse gave up. It lived, sure, but the part of it that made it special, that spark, it was gone. Her eyes stayed fixed on the corral, on the horse who still carried old wounds like a map across his hide. I remember looking at that poor thing and thinking, if I wasn't careful, I'd end up just like it, walking around breathing but empty. Nantan slowly set down the brush he'd been cleaning and looked over at her. Really looked. It was the first time that morning their eyes had met. "So you didn't let him take that from you," he said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor felt something shift deep in her chest at the quiet conviction in his voice. "I held on to what mattered," she said. "Built up walls around the parts of me that still felt like mine. Learned how to smile when I had to, and how to keep my real self tucked away where he couldn't touch it." "That's a lonely way to live," Nantan said gently. Her laugh came quick and without humor. Lonely, sure, but alive. And after he was gone, I realized I kinda liked making my own choices again, saying what I wanted when I felt like saying it. Nantan picked up the bucket of oats and rose to his feet with a slow, unhurried motion. "Once you've tasted freedom," he said, "it's hard to let it go again." As he walked toward the corral, he kept a respectful distance. Diablo didn't back off. Instead, the horse's ears flicked forward, watching him come. When Nantan was about 10 feet out, He lowered himself to the ground and set the bucket beside him. "What now?" Eleanor asked quietly from her place at the fence. "Now we wait," Nantan said, not taking his eyes off the horse. "We let him choose what happens next." Eleanor watched closely as Nantan dipped his hand into the bucket and let the oats run slow between his fingers, falling in a soft, dry stream onto the earth. The sweet scent of grain drifted on the breeze. Diablo lifted his head and sniffed the air. Minutes ticked by slow as molasses. Then finally, the stallion shifted. A single step forward, then another. His movements were deliberate, cautious, muscles tight, eyes alert, ready to bolt if anything felt off. But he wasn't pulling away. He was closing the gap. "Easy now," Nantan murmured, his voice quiet as a prayer. "Ain't nobody gonna push you. We've got time." Eleanor held her breath as the horse reached the fence line. Diablo's posture was tight, ears pricked, but not hostile. Not afraid. Curious. He stopped just shy of the rail's neck, stretched out, nostrils flaring as he studied the man sitting in the dirt. Nantan didn't move. Let the horse look him over. His scent, his shape, his breath. Slowly, cautiously, Diablo reached his head forward and sniffed the bucket. Nantan didn't react, just held his hand out, palm open, oats resting in the center. "You decide how close you want to get," Nantan said, barely louder than the breeze. Eleanor could hardly believe what she was seeing. Diablo took another step, soft and measured. He was close enough now for Nantan to touch him, could have stroked his neck even, but Nantan didn't lift a finger, just held his hand there steady as a stone. The space between them felt sacred, like something delicate that would shatter if anyone spoke too soon. Then, as gentle as rain on canvas, Diablo lowered his head and lipped the oats from Nantan's palm. Eleanor felt tears sting the corners of her eyes. It was nothing short of a miracle. Since Chester's death, no one had come this close. Diablo had kept his distance, kicked at hands, bitten at strangers. And now here he was, accepting an offering from a man who asked for nothing, demanded nothing, and gave him the choice. It wasn't just about feeding a horse. It was about trust, about grace. "Well done," she whispered, voice catching in her throat. Nantan didn't move until Diablo stepped back on his own, retreating a few paces, but not bolting. The horse stood in the middle of the corral, head high, ears forward, watching Nantan like he was trying to figure something out. "That's enough for today," Nantan said, rising with slow care. He brushed his hands off oat dust clinging to his fingertips. "Trust don't come all at once," he said. "Gotta earn it one step at a time." As they made their way back toward the house, Eleanor couldn't help thinking how much that small moment mirrored her own path, this slow unwinding of fear, this gentle testing of boundaries. Like Diablo, she'd spent years staying just out of reach, flinching at sudden moves, expecting every outstretched hand to come with a cost. "Hey," she said when they reached the porch. Nantan turned, and for a second she saw something in his face. Recognition, maybe. Something real. "Thank you," she said. He gave a quiet nod, tipped his hat. "Still early days," he said. "But it's a good beginning." Then he walked off toward the bunkhouse, leaving her there with the wind and the sun creeping over the hills. Her eyes dropped to her hand again. The wedding band caught a thread of light. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor let herself wonder what it might mean to turn the diamond outward again, to stop hiding. The thought scared her more than she'd like to admit, but this time she didn't push it away. "Well, I'll be damned," came a voice behind Eleanor, sharp and familiar enough to make her flinch. She turned to find Jake Morrison leaning his shoulder into the fence rail, arms folded, and wearing that permanent scowl he always seemed to have handy. Jake was one of the men who'd tried to take on Diablo months earlier, and failed hard. Judging by the sour look on his face, watching Nantan make progress was rubbing him the wrong way. "Looks like your quiet Indian fella's got himself a trick," Jake muttered, not bothering to hide the bite in his tone. "We'll see how long that lasts once he tries to throw a saddle on that demon." Eleanor bristled at the remark, the way Jake said it, like Nantan wasn't standing just a few feet away. "It's not a trick, Jake. It's called knowing what the hell you're doing." Jake snorted. "Takes more than a soft voice and some feed to break a Mustang. Anybody can rub a horse's nose and call it progress. The real test is when you put your weight in the stirrups." As if summoned, Nantan stood slowly from his place near the corral. Diablo's eyes followed the movement, curious but calm. No flinch, no retreat. "That's plenty for today," Nantan said, his voice carrying across the dry morning air. "Some things you force 'em, they break." Jake pushed off the fence with a huff and an eye roll. "Mark my words, Eleanor. Sooner or later that horse'll send your gentle cowboy flying same as he did the rest of us. All this whisper and wait nonsense just dragging out the inevitable." Eleanor watched him walk off, heat rising in her chest, not from the sun, but from something deeper. Jake's sneering tone reminded her too much of Chester, always mocking what he didn't understand, always measuring strength by how loud or hard a man hit. "Don't pay him no mind," Nantan said, coming to stand beside her. "Some folks can't see past the way they've always done things." She studied him, noticing again the way his voice never rose even when someone spit fire his way. "Doesn't bother you?" she asked. "Having people talk like that, saying you're wasting your time?" He was quiet for a while, eyes on Diablo, who stood still in the middle of the corral watching the two of them without a trace of fear. "I figured out a long time ago that what folks think doesn't change what's real," Nantan said eventually. "That horse and I, we know what's happening. That's what counts." As they walked back toward the house, Eleanor kept thinking about the difference between what she used to think of as strength and what she was seeing now. There was something undeniably steady about the way Nantan approached life, slow, deliberate, respectful. Not weak, never that. It was the kind of strength that didn't need to break anything to prove it was there. When they reached the porch, Eleanor paused, her hand resting on the post. "Nantan," she said. He turned toward her, and something passed between them, something quiet, but deep. "Would you care to have dinner with me tonight? In the house, I mean. I'd like to hear more about your way of doing things." His smile was small but genuine. "I'd be honored, ma'am." She stayed on the porch, watching him walk toward the barn. Her hand drifted to the gold band on her finger, almost without her realizing it. For the first time in a long while, she was actually looking forward to sharing a meal with a man, not out of politeness, not from habit, but because she genuinely wanted his company. Later in the kitchen, as she prepared the evening meal, Eleanor found herself being more careful than usual. She told herself it was simple hospitality. He was a guest after all, but there was something else behind her care, something she wasn't quite ready to name. Nantan had stirred something inside her that had been dormant for years, and for once, she didn't feel the urge to bury it. When he knocked on the door, his shirt clean, his hair tied back. Neat. Eleanor's chest gave a small flutter that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with what might be waiting on the other side of this night. "Come on in," she said, stepping aside. As Nantan crossed the threshold, she knew she wasn't just letting him into her home. She was allowing him into the quiet corners of a life she hadn't opened to anyone since Chester died. But now, sitting at Eleanor's kitchen table, the air filled with the scent of cornbread and stew, her laugh soft and unguarded, he found his thoughts shifting. As the sky outside turned that deep violet shade the desert does just before full night, two people who knew pain by name sat together and shared warmth, stories, silence. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. Outside, the black stallion stood by the fence, his gaze fixed on the house. He watched not as prey, not with fear, but with something else, as if he knew somehow that what was being rebuilt inside was just as important as anything happening in the corral. 2 weeks had passed since Nantan's arrival, and what once seemed impossible was starting to look possible. Not only did Diablo tolerate him, he looked for him each morning, waited by the gate, ears forward, body relaxed. Eleanor found herself watching these moments from different angles around the ranch, sometimes from the porch, sometimes through the barn door, always drawn in by the way Nantan worked, quiet, thoughtful, deliberate. There was something undeniably powerful about a man who didn't need to shout to be heard, who understood that presence meant more than pressure. Then came the morning she wouldn't forget. From the kitchen window, she saw Nantan step into the corral with more than just his usual bucket of oats and the harmonica tucked into his pocket. He carried a soft brush and a lead rope. Diablo didn't shy. He turned ears twitching, curious. And when Nantan sat down just like always, the stallion came to him without hesitation. First came the music, the slow, familiar tune Eleanor had heard a dozen times now, the one that meant safe to Diablo. Then, bit by bit, Nantan introduced the brush. He didn't force it, just held it low, let Diablo sniff it, study it. And that's when the horse did something that stopped Eleanor in her tracks. He leaned in. Before either of them could say another word, the sound of hooves crunching through gravel turned their heads toward the window. Eleanor stepped closer and saw Jake Morrison riding in with two men she didn't recognize, both wearing the kind of expressions that spelled trouble before anyone even spoke. Nantan was already on his feet, the change in his posture instant. The calm, easy presence he'd carried all evening sharpened into something more alert, more focused. Eleanor caught the way his whole body shifted, quiet but ready, like a man who'd learned the cost of not reacting fast enough. "Friends of yours?" he asked, though the tone in his voice told her he already knew better. Eleanor gave a tight shake of her head, eyes still on Jake and his crew dismounting out front. "Jake's been picking a fight since the day you got here," she said. "Looks like he finally worked up the nerve to bring it to my door." Nantan stepped carefully to the side of the window, placing himself in the blind angle where he could see without being seen. He moved so fluidly, it was like muscle memory, an instinct carved from places he didn't talk about. That's when Eleanor noticed something she hadn't before, the way his hand settled naturally near his hip, and the outline of a sidearm beneath his coat. From outside came Jake's voice, clear and cutting across the yard like a blade. "Mrs. McAllister, we need a word." Eleanor glanced at Nantan. His shoulders were tight now, his stance set. No panic, just a readiness that made her realize this man had stood in the path of worse than Jake Morrison. "Stay inside," he said quietly. "Let me take care of this." The words made Eleanor bristle. "This is my land, Nantan. If there's a fight, it's mine too." He turned and looked at her, and in that moment she saw why men had once followed him into battles most wouldn't come out of. There was a quiet authority in him, something that didn't demand it earned. And somehow she knew if he was stepping out there, it wasn't to be a hero, It was because he understood exactly what it meant to protect something you've grown to care for. Before she could argue again, he was already at the door, his steps soundless, purposeful. Watching him walk out onto the porch, Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. This wasn't just about concern anymore. Somewhere along the way, her feelings for this steady, quiet man had started to take root, and that truth scared her more than the three men now standing on her property. Nantan moved with the same composure he used in the corral, every motion measured. He stopped on the porch gaze level. His presence didn't fill the space with noise or threat. It held it with calm weight. Jake stood 20 feet away, flanked by two thick-set men with the look of folks who solved problems using fists first and questions never. "Mornin', Jake," Nantan said, adjusting his hat with a casual grace. "Fine day to be riding, ain't it?" Jake's mouth curled in a sneer. "Cut the crap, Apache. You know damn well why I'm here." "Do I?" Nantan's tone stayed easy, but Eleanor, watching from just inside the screen door, noticed the slight shift in his stance, subtle, balanced, ready. "Why don't you tell me since you came all this way?" Jake's lip curled. "You're making a joke of every man who tried before you. 30 good cowboys gave it everything to break that demon horse. Then you come along with your flute and your whispers, and suddenly you're the horse messiah. That don't sit right." Nantan gave a small nod, thoughtful. "That's what's got you riled up." One of the other men, barrel-chested and red-faced, took a step forward. "It makes us look like we didn't try hard enough," he growled. "Maybe you didn't," Nantan said simply, and that was all it took. Jake's face turned crimson, and his hand twitched toward the gun at his side. Eleanor's breath caught. Nantan didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, but the air changed, sudden and sharp. That stillness in him was no longer peaceful. It was ready. "I ain't calling you anything," he said, voice calm even. "But if you go for that gun, you'd best mean to use it, 'cause I won't be giving you another chance." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They came out like truth spoken by a man who'd faced worse than empty threats and left it behind him. Jake's fingers froze. Even his companions shifted uneasily. Eleanor saw it, then saw not the gentle man who spoke to horses like they were people, but the soldier, the survivor, a man who'd done what had to be done and carried the weight afterward in silence. "This ain't over," Jake muttered, though his hand had dropped from his hip. "It is if you've got any sense left," Nantan replied. "Mrs. McAllister hired me to help her horse. That's what I'm doing. You don't like how I do it. That's fine, but you don't get to step into my work or threaten her home." Jake looked like he had a few more words boiling in him, but something in Nantan's expression made him think better of it. After a moment of clenching his jaw and glancing sideways at his men, he gave a curt nod. "Let's go," he barked, and they all turned toward their horses. As the sound of hoofbeats faded down the drive, Eleanor stepped outside and stood beside Nantan. She didn't speak at first, just stood there, letting the quiet settle again. She could see the way his shoulders began to lower, the sharp lines around his jaw relaxing. That alert, battle-scarred part of him slowly giving way to the quieter self she was coming to know and trust. 2 weeks had passed, though Eleanor couldn't tell if it felt like forever or no time at all. Whatever rhythm she and Nantan had found was interrupted one hot afternoon by the familiar creak of wagon wheels. She looked out the window and immediately stiffened. Doc Henderson was pulling up the drive in his beat-up wagon, and the look on his face wasn't the one he wore for friendly visits. He wasn't the type to drop by for idle chat, especially not in the middle of a weekday. "Nantan, Doc's here," she said quietly as she moved toward the door. Nantan stood from the porch rail where he'd been sharpening a bit of tack, his body straightening slightly. Doc climbed down from the wagon with the slow, careful steps of a man whose joints had long since turned against him. Eleanor Nantan. Doc greeted voice a little gravelly. Mind if I have a word? Eleanor gestured toward the porch chairs. Course, Doc. You want some coffee? He shook his head, settling down into one of the chairs with a quiet sigh. Eleanor noticed how drawn he looked, older than his 67 years, and carrying something heavy behind his eyes. This isn't a social call, he said, his voice low. I've been sitting on this a while, trying to figure if it's my place to say anything at all. Nantan leaned against a post, his stance relaxed but alert. What's got you troubled? Doc. Doc's gaze flicked between the two of them. The lines on his face seemed deeper than usual. It's Chester, he said finally. About how he died. Eleanor felt her stomach turn to ice. Chester's death had always been chalked up to an accident, a spooked horse during a card game gone sideways. A kick to the chest. Sudden. Brutal. But not suspicious. What about it? Eleanor asked, though every part of her body screamed not to. Doc reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of folded paper, his hands shaking more than she'd ever seen. Jake Morrison showed up at my place last night drunk off his ass. He was ranting about you and Nantan, how you're making a joke of every man in this territory. Said some things I couldn't ignore. And he left this. Eleanor took the paper, her hands numb before she even opened it. The handwriting was Jake's, sloppy and slurred across the page. But the words sobered her instantly. It was a confession. A rambling, guilt-soaked admission Chester hadn't died in a horse accident. He'd been caught cheating at cards, pulled a gun in anger. Jake, in the heat of the moment, had shot him dead. Then, in a panic, they'd faked the scene, staged a fall, bribed witnesses, even altered the report. Eleanor's eyes kept moving, her breath shallow until she reached the end. I can't keep watching you walk around like the grieving widow, Eleanor. You know what Chester was, what he did to you. We thought we were doing you a kindness, but watching you with that Apache makes me think maybe we were just cowards too scared to face what we did. The paper slipped from her fingers, drifting to the floor like it weighed more than she could hold. In the stillness that followed, even the horses seemed to sense something had shifted. Diablo kicked at the dirt in the corral, restless. Nantan bent and picked up the paper, reading it quickly, his face unreadable until the very end, when his jaw locked tight and his eyes turned to stone. He turned to Doc, and Eleanor saw the older man shift in his seat under the pressure of Nantan's stare. How long have you known Nantan? Asked, voice quiet but lethal. Doc's shoulders dropped. I had my suspicions from the start. The wounds never matched the story. Powder burns on the shirt horses don't leave those behind. He looked at Eleanor, guilt settling into every wrinkle on his face. I should have said something, but Jake and his pals stuck to their story and what Eleanor asked, barely above a whisper. Doc hesitated. And I thought, maybe you were better off without him. Her stomach twisted. So you all knew, she said flatly. Knew what he did to me. And you let it go. Doc winced. We heard things. Saw things. Bruises. Excuses. We knew, but we didn't know what to do. He had a way of making folks feel helpless. You thought I deserved it. Eleanor's voice was rising now, something years in the making finally breaking through. Or maybe it was just easier to look the other way while he beat me bloody. We thought if we tried to step in, he'd take it out on you worse, Doc mumbled. Nantan's hands had curled into fists, jaw clenched hard. So you let her suffer. And when he finally got what he had coming, you covered it up to protect the man who pulled the trigger. It wasn't like that Doc started. It was exactly like that, Nantan said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Cowards, every damn one of you. Eleanor stood up so fast her chair scraped hard across the floorboards. Her whole body felt like it was about to come apart. Everything, her independence, the reputation she'd built since Chester's death, it was all wrapped in a lie. Get out, she said, voice flat. Eleanor, please, get off my land, she shouted, her restraint finally shattering. Don't you ever come back. Doc struggled to his feet, gray and shaken. I am sorry. I thought you needed the truth. Eleanor let out a bitter laugh. The truth. The truth is, I was living in a world of liars. The truth is, everyone who said they cared stood back and did nothing. For years. She didn't watch him leave, but she heard the wagon creak down the drive and disappear into the dust. When the noise faded, she dropped into her chair like the air had gone out of her lungs, her head in her hands. Nantan knelt beside her, his voice low. Eleanor, don't, she said. Please, just don't. This doesn't change anything between us. She laughed again, dry, sharp. Doesn't it? My husband was a violent, cheating bastard who died over a card game, and this town covered it up. My land, my freedom, they were all paid for with blood, with lies. Nantan was quiet for a long breath. Then he reached out, gently touching her chin, guiding her to look at him. He was those things. Yes, he said. But you aren't him. You don't owe anyone shame for what he did. You don't understand, she whispered. I stayed. I made excuses. For 8 years. What does that make me? He didn't hesitate. It makes you a woman trying to survive, doing the best she could while stuck in something no one should have to bear. I could have left. I had money. I had choices. Did you? He asked gently. Or did he convince you otherwise? Make you believe no one would believe you or help you or stand beside you? Did he isolate you? Tear down your trust in yourself? She stared at him, her breath catching. Because yes, that's exactly what Chester had done. He was clever, she whispered. Twisted things to look like love. Said he was keeping me safe from the world. When the real danger was in your own home, Nantan said softly. Eleanor, there's no weakness in being manipulated by someone who promised to love you. No shame in trying to make the best of hell. Tears streamed down her face as she looked into his eyes and saw something she didn't expect. Not pity, not judgment. Understanding. Something cracked open in Eleanor's chest, not like something shattering, but like something long frozen, thawing at last. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve. What do we do now? She asked. Nantan picked up the letter Jake had dropped, his fingers closing around it like it held the weight of more than just ink and guilt. Well, he said steadily, now we figure out what justice looks like. His eyes stayed on the page as he spoke. Jake Morrison and his crew didn't just kill a man, they covered it up, dragged everyone into a lie. The question is, do we let him walk away from it? Eleanor looked out over her land, that wide-open stretch of desert that had always felt like freedom. But now it felt heavy. She thought of the years she'd spent under Chester's hand, the silence that wrapped around her like a second skin. She thought of the lies that had defined her past and how little she'd known about the truths others had been hiding. And then she thought of everything that had happened since Nantan came, of how she'd begun to feel like herself again, of the quiet strength he'd shown her was possible. "I don't want revenge," she said finally, voice steady. "I just want the truth to matter. I want folks to stop pretending Chester was someone he never was. He wasn't some upstanding rancher. He was a violent man, and he got what was coming." Nantan nodded slowly. "We can take it to Sheriff Martinez. Let the law carry it from here." Eleanor's eyes drifted to the corral where Diablo was grazing peacefully. The fire in him hadn't gone out, but it had softened. He was still wild at heart, but no longer wounded, no longer untrusting. She saw the parallel clearly. Healing didn't mean erasing the pain. It meant facing it and choosing to live beyond it. "Nantan," she said, her voice low but full of meaning. "Thank you for hearing me, for not trying to fix me or explain me or tell me how I should feel." He gave her that small smile, the one that only ever showed up when his guard was truly down. "Thank you," he said in return for letting me in. "All the way." As they sat side by side on the porch, watching the sun dip low behind the hills, Eleanor realized something surprising. Jake's confession hadn't wrecked what she'd built. It had cleaned out the rot that had been hiding in the beams. For the first time since Chester's death, she felt whole. Not because he was gone, but because she finally understood that none of it, his fists, his fury, his death, had ever been her fault. His shame had never belonged to her. And now, in its place, she had something real, something honest. Love not as possession, but as partnership. The fallout from Jake's drunken letter rippled through the ranch, but not in the way Eleanor once feared. Instead of breaking her, the truth settled in like a foundation she could finally stand on. She moved through the next few days with a certainty that left Nantan both impressed and a little in awe. The first thing she did was ride into Esperanza alone, Jake's confession tucked firmly into her satchel. Nantan had offered to come with her, but she'd met his concern with a kind smile and a steady refusal. "This is mine to carry," she'd said. "For 2 years I let people tell my story for me. That ends now." She returned later that evening, dusty and worn, but carrying a sense of quiet triumph. "Martinez took Jake in this morning," she told Nantan as she stepped down from her horse. "Still drunk when they found him. Didn't even try to deny what he'd written. The other 2 are in custody too." Nantan gave a small nod, watching her closely. He could see the emotional weight riding just under her skin. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. Eleanor paused, genuinely thinking about it. Relieved, mad, sad. All at once, she said, "But mostly, I'm just glad the truth isn't hiding anymore." Over the following week, she made more changes. She rode back to town and sat down with the banker, transferring a hefty portion of her estate into a fund for the local orphanage. When Nantan asked her why, her answer was simple: money born from blood and silence ought to be used for something good. But it was what changed between them that struck Nantan the most. The careful boundaries that had defined their relationship melted away. She touched him more freely now, a hand on his arm when she laughed, a thumb brushing against his when she passed him coffee. Small things, quiet things. But to Nantan they thundered. She wasn't shielding her heart anymore, and that scared him more than he cared to admit. He'd grown comfortable with their unspoken rhythm, the long silences, the slow-building trust, the space they allowed each other. But Eleanor's boldness now forced him to look at what he'd been avoiding, his own fear of loving someone again, of possibly losing them too. As if life had a sense of timing, the month-long challenge with Diablo was nearing its close. Only 5 days remained. By all accounts, Nantan had succeeded. The stallion accepted the saddle, now followed commands, and had let Nantan mount him twice, brief but significant. By the terms of Eleanor's offer, the challenge was complete. Diablo had been tamed. And yet Nantan hadn't declared it done. Because the moment he said the job was finished, he'd no longer have a reason to stay. Eleanor's eyes were locked on the corral, on the man sitting tall and quiet on the back of a horse no one thought could be ridden. Diablo stood like black smoke made flesh muscle scars and restless fire, and yet under Nantan he held still, alert but calm. No reins, no spurs, no whip. Just a man on his back breathing the same dusty morning air. Nantan wasn't riding in the way folks were used to seeing. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't forcing Diablo to obey. He just sat there, spine straight, feet light in the stirrups, his whole body a quiet conversation of trust and patience. Then slowly, Diablo started to walk. Not a lurch, not a bolt. A walk. One circle. Two. By the third, the entire town was dead quiet. A kid dropped his jaw. An old-timer muttered, "Lord help me, I'll be damned." Then came the first clap from one of the ranch hands who'd tried and failed to ride Diablo months ago. That clap sparked another, and then another, until a thunder of applause rolled through the street, thick as summer thunder. Eleanor felt her breath catch. Her heart should have been pounding, but instead, it was still, steady, like it had finally come home after wandering lost in the dark. And then just as suddenly, a gunshot cracked through the morning. Chaos. Diablo reared, not wild, but startled. His body twisted hooves, striking the dust eyes flaring. Nantan's hand stayed steady on the horse's neck. His other arm curled back in pain. He'd been hit. Eleanor couldn't remember moving, but she was at his side, her hands pressing against the blood blooming through the sleeve of his shirt. Left shoulder, clean through but bleeding fast. Diablo didn't flee. That alone would have stunned her on any other day. The horse that had once struck fear into every rancher for 20 miles was standing between Nantan and the shooter, nostrils wide, ready to fight. The shooter didn't run either. Jake Morrison stood at the edge of the crowd, revolver still in hand, face twisted with something between rage and regret. "Drop the weapon!" Martinez barked, gun drawn, as he shouldered through the crowd. Jake's gun hit the ground with a soft clatter, but his eyes were locked on Nantan like he still couldn't believe what he'd done. Nantan's voice came out rough but calm. "I'm not pulling mine." Martinez hesitated like he needed to be sure what he'd heard. "I said I won't shoot," Nantan repeated. "That's not how I settle this. Do it by the book." Martinez gave a tight nod and snapped the cuffs on Jake with a speed born of habit and disgust. Eleanor pressed harder on the wound. The blood soaked through her blouse, warm and terrifying, but different than before. This wasn't a man hurting her. This was a man she would bleed for, would stand beside. "You're not going anywhere," she whispered. Nantan managed a weak smile. "Didn't plan to." Jake Morrison was charged with murder and conspiracy within 24 hours. By sundown, news had spread across Esperanza like wildfire, burning away whatever illusions the town still clung to. The saloon emptied. Men whispered. Women stared down at their hands. People who had nodded politely to Eleanor for 2 years now couldn't meet her eyes. And still the person they spoke about the most was Nantan. A sheriff's deputy from Santa Fe called it one of the cleanest takedowns in town history. But Sheriff Martinez said something different when the reporters asked him for a quote. Justice wasn't brought in by a badge, he told them. It rode in on the back of a horse, taught us what patience and mercy really look like. When Nantan was released from the doctor's care arm in a sling, eyes still sharp as flint, Eleanor stood beside him on the steps of the courthouse and made the announcement that changed everything. "We'll be running the McAllister Ranch together," she said. "From now on, this land is no longer just mine. It's ours." And with that, she told the town the ranch would be renamed. From this day forward, she said this place will be called Forest Fire and Freedom Wind. The name rang strange to some ears, but it settled in her heart like it had always been waiting there, a tribute to both their roots, to destruction and rebirth, to healing that came not from silence, but from the strength to speak. The weeks that followed brought more than just change. They brought purpose. Nantan took what he knew, what his people had known for generations, and began teaching it. Not with lectures, not with drills, with music. He opened a training program that welcomed anyone willing to listen. Children, widows, ranch hands. Even the same men who once spit in the dirt when he walked by showed up hats in hand, asking if he'd show them how he'd done it, how he got Diablo to trust him. They brought him their own half-wild horses, each one scarred in some way. And Nantan never raised his voice. He taught them that stillness spoke louder than shouts, and that a frightened horse wasn't stubborn, it was hurt. Some folks cried the first time a horse came to them without fear. Others just sat real quiet, like they'd seen something sacred. And beside it all, Eleanor found her own mission. She cleared out the east barn, painted the walls, and filled it with cots and shelves and quiet. It became a shelter for women who had nowhere to go, wives escaping fists, mothers hiding from men who only knew how to take. She didn't ask questions when they arrived. She offered them a place to sleep, a patch of land, a horse of their own if they wanted it. And always, always, she told them, "You can start again, right here." The house filled with voices again. Some whispered, some loud with laughter. The smell of stew and saddle oil hung in the air. The sound of hooves and heeling stretched across the ranch like wind through the cottonwoods. One night, Nantan sat beside Eleanor on the porch, Diablo grazing nearby his body, a shadow against the moonlight. "You sure this is what you want?" he asked quietly. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. "It's the first thing that's ever felt like it was mine." They sat there a while longer, hands touching words unspoken. And though there would still be hard days and fear and doubt, they both knew one thing without needing to say it. The demon had been tamed, but it wasn't the horse they meant. Hey friends, if you've made it this far, first of all, thank you. And second, wow, what a journey, right? This story for me was never just about a wild horse or a quiet man. It was about healing, about how pain doesn't always show up in bruises and strength doesn't always look like a fist. Sometimes it looks like silence, like waiting, like playing a flute to earn trust instead of demanding it. What touched me most was the humanity woven into every single moment. Eleanor's strength wasn't in surviving Chester, it was in the choice to start over, to open her heart again. And Nantan, his patience, his quiet dignity showed us that justice doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. There's a part of this story that stays with me, the idea that real change doesn't come from forcing others, but from giving them space to choose a new path. Diablo wasn't broken, he was listened to. And just like him, so many of us are just waiting for someone to see us without judgment. This tale reminded me that we all carry wounds, but we also carry the power to heal ourselves and each other. And sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is simply stay, to love gently, to speak the truth even when it shakes the ground we stand on. So tell me what part of this story hit you the hardest. What did you take away from it? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's keep this conversation going. And hey, if this story stirred something in you, maybe share it with someone who needs it. You never know who's waiting to feel understood. See you in the next one.